The American First Army took many casualties in Normandy, far more than the British Second Army. Many reasons have been advanced to account for this variance, including the suggestion that the British were holding back and letting the American soldiers do all the fighting. This is tantamount to saying that the British soldier lacked guts. This line can play well with the more chauvinistic historians, but readers may care to note that none of the hundreds of American veterans interviewed by this author over the years has ever made such a suggestion. This may be simple courtesy, but a significant number of American veterans, including those who endured the landing on Omaha, also went out of their way to urge that full attention be paid to their British and Canadian comrades in Normandy, and the same urging has come from British veterans over their American comrades. This author can recall that one British veteran, recalling the American tank crews taking on German 88mm in the Bocage, had tears in his eyes when talking of those bloody Yank fools, but they were brave bloody fools. As this book has already revealed, the fighting and the delays in Normandy seem to be evenly spread among the Allied armies. This opinion is not fueled by chauvinism, but based on official accounts from national sources. Still, the discrepancy in casualties remains, and it needs to be accounted for. Poor training must have made a significant contribution to US losses, and not only in the 90th Infantry Division. The 83rd Division, the 90th Division, and some other American units were simply not well enough trained for the sort of fighting they were swiftly plunged into when they came ashore in Normandy. Motivation and leadership must also have something to do with it. The fine performance of many excellent US divisions, the 82nd and 101st Airborne, 1st Infantry, 29th Infantry, 4th Infantry, and 9th Infantry Divisions, to name but a few, are evidence of the importance that must be given to these essential factors. However, the real answer to the basic problem of high battlefield losses was discipline, motivation, and more training in the right tactics for the battle the troops were currently fighting. Hedgerow fighting called for individual infantry skills, tank and infantry, fieldcraft, camouflage, fire and movement, plus the use of grenades and light support weapons, especially mortars, at very close range. Individual skills and infantry-tank cooperation are not much practiced at the training camps and battle schools, where small unit tactics at squad, section, or platoon level tend to take up most of the time. In the Bocage, the young American infantryman was often on his own, out of sight of his comrades, facing an enemy who was not afraid to come to close quarters, who could always manage a counterattack and attacked with automatic weapons, grenades, mortars, even the sharp-edged infantry spade, and had close support from tanks, while using the Panzerfaust to keep the US tanks at bay. It is also more than possible that the US infantry units could have used more support. As at Omaha on D-Day, studying the Normandy battle imparts the feeling that, again and again, too much was left to the infantry soldier, and more support from tanks, artillery and aircraft might have reduced their losses. There was also pressure on the US commanders to produce results quickly. The all-too-rapid sackings of divisional commanders is evidence of this fact, and this may have led these commanders to take chances which pushed up the casualty figures. It may also be that the Americans were less casualty-conscious than the British. Having more manpower, they were willing to take higher losses in attempting to get the job done quickly. The growing shortage of British manpower was another inhibition to such attrition on the Second Army front, but there was another factor, less often mentioned, which may have had a bearing on this matter. The British generals often had first-hand experience of the carnage of modern war, dating from their time as subalterns on the Somme or in Flanders during the Great War. The American generals' attitudes to war were not coloured by that dire experience. Fortunately, American ingenuity and get-up-and-go came at least partially to the rescue of the beleaguered US infantry in the Bocage with the invention of the Rhino, the Bocage-busting tank. The US official history attributes this useful invention in early July to Sergeant Curtis G. Cullen J&R of the 102 Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron. Cullen conceived the idea of welding steel bars and ploughshares to the front of a Sherman tank. Allied tanks suffered heavy losses from Panzerfausts when crossing hedgerows, because the vulnerable, poorly armoured belly of the Sherman tank was fully exposed when the tank reared up to mount the hedge bank. Sergeant Cullen's invention cut directly into the bank and held the tank down as it broke through, thus clearing a wide gap for other tanks to follow. This invention was inspected by General Bradley on July 14th, and orders for more rhinos were issued that afternoon. Within days, welding teams were at work fitting this device to tanks, self-propelled guns and tank destroyers right across the US line. This was the one example of specialized armor produced by the Americans, who might have profitably employed the range of mine-clearing, flame-throwing and gap-bridging tanks used by the British 79th Armoured Division, but one wonders if a British general would have been so quick to accept an idea from a mere sergeant. Steps were also being taken to improve air-to-ground communications between the troops and the tactical air forces. Short bombing, ground strafing of their own troops and positions were still occurring, and poor communications plus poor training on both sides of the radio link were making tactical air support less effective than it might have been. This support was increasing as more airstrips were opened, and USAAF fighter groups and RAF ground attack Typhoon squadrons were now moving to France at the rate of 2 a week. This increased the amount of support available because aircraft no longer had to return to the UK to refuel and rearm. On the other hand, the need to bring in aviation fuel, bombs, rockets and spare parts for a range of aircraft increased the already heavy demands on the RAF and USAAF supply and logistical units. These arrangements, the training, the rhinos, the greater availability of tactical air support, were all on stream for Cobra the St. Lo breakout. For Cobra, General Bradley assembled 15 divisions in 4 corps of 1st Army, although one of these corps, Middleton's 8th and the 90th Division, actually belonged to Patton's 3rd Army. More units were arriving. 8 US divisions, 4 infantry and 4 armoured, arrived in Normandy in July, bringing the US total to 22 divisions, 14 infantry, 6 armoured and 2 airborne. 4 more divisions 1 a week were expected in August, and as many again in September. Patton's 3rd Army HQ had arrived in the Cotentin in July, and 3rd Army was only waiting for the breakthrough to become operational. In anticipation of having 2 US armies in France, the HQ of the US 1st Army Group, which Bradley would command, began to move to France on July 5th and was on station by the start of August. Meanwhile, on the Caen front, the Canadian 1st Army became operational on July 23rd under General Crérard. On July 12th, Bradley presented his Cobra plan to a conference of his staff and corps commanders. The start line for the attack would be the Perrier-Saint-Lô highway, and the breakout, led by Collins's 7th Corps, would take place on a 4.5-mile front across the Coutances-Saint-Lô plateau. South of the highway, a slight problem, because even on the night before the attack, 2 US divisions, the 4th Armoured and the 83rd Infantry, were not on their start line. Once on the plateau, which was bocage country, the divisions of 7th Corps were to veer west, towards Coutances, a move which would trap any German units left in the Cotentin unless they were quickly withdrawn. For this task, the 7th Corps would be beefed up virtually to army size. Collins would have 5 divisions, 3 infantry and 2 armoured. The attack would be preceded by a massive bombing of the area south of the Saint-Lô-Perrier highway by heavy bombers of the 8th Air Force. 2 infantry divisions, the 9th and 30th, would then make a 3-mile-wide breach between Marigny and Saint-Gilles, immediately west of Saint-Lô. The 2 armoured divisions, the 3rd and the 2nd, the latter formerly with 5th Corps, would pass through, and the veteran 1st Infantry Division, now motorised, would exploit the breach. Joe Collins's massive corps was then further enlarged with the return of the 4th Infantry Division, which was also put into the assault. The British and Canadians had 1 army apiece in Normandy. With Collins's big corps, the 1st Army and the 3rd Army, the Americans effectively had 3. While 7th Corps were charging southwest for Coutances, 8th Corps, the pressure force for this attack, would advance down the west coast, weighing down on the enemy forces to its front. When these moves had been completed, the entire 1st Army, having pivoted at Caumont, would consolidate on a line between Coutances and Caumont facing east. All this was in conformity with the original Montgomery plan, but if all went well, the troops were then to push on and exploit any advantage to gain ground without waiting to consolidate, and they had the force to do this. Meanwhile, the US troops in the two corps east of the Vire, 5th Corps and 19th Corps, were to keep the German units on their front fully occupied, 19th Corps by patrolling action and shelling, 5th Corps by an attack to the south on the second day of Cobra. When First Army had cleared the Germans out of the way, Middleton's 8th Corps would lead Patton's Third Army out of the Cotentin and on to Brittany and the Loire. Bradley's plan had been modified somewhat by Collins, whose 7th Corps had now been increased to 6 divisions, virtually an army, agrees the US official history, and this was sensible because the entire success of Cobra really depended on Collins. In the final plan, 3 infantry divisions of this corps, the 4th, 9th and 30th, were to make the initial breakthrough by making rapid follow-up after bombing. Once they had torn a breach in the German line, the 1st Infantry Division and a combat command of the 3rd Armoured Division would drive directly for Coutances and the sea. The rest of 7th Corps would head in the same direction, but on a wider front, aiming to envelop Coutances and any German troops left in the area. Collins did not intend that the advance of his corps should impede the southward thrust of Middleton's 8th Corps towards Avranches. If Middleton could storm ahead down the west coast, Collins would not get in his way or let 7th Corps units get across his front. To aid this attack, 7th Corps would also have the benefit of most of First Army's artillery and a vast quantity of ammunition, 140,000 shells for the initial bombardment, but the crucial element in this breakthrough was the heavy bombing just before the attack. Bradley's plan, especially after Collins's adjustments, was to strike the enemy a devastating blow with this whole army-sized corps, and then pour in troops and armour and keep going until the enemy collapsed. The German front might be tough, but by now it had to be thin. Very few reinforcements were reaching the German front lines. What did arrive was immobile and without motor transport, and there were only 1.5 panzer divisions, 2 SS and what was left of Panzer Lehr to provide the basis for counterattacks. The answer to any attack is a counterattack, and the Germans had no power to make one. And then the final element, air power. To ensure that the bomber commanders understood the importance of their input to the opening phase, Bradley went to England on July 19th and went over the plan carefully with the USAAF commanders for both the 9th and 8th Air Forces. As described, the start line was the bomb line, the Saint-Lô-Perrier Highway. To avoid any short bombing, the troops would withdraw to positions half a mile north of this road, and all the bombs were to be dropped south of it. This was still very close, but had the advantage of offering a rapid follow-up onto the defenders' positions before the defenders recovered. The bombs were to fall in an area 7,000 metres long and some 2,500 metres wide, say 4.5 miles wide and 1.5 miles deep. Bradley made it clear that the US bombers were not to fly in over the ground troops, but across their front, east to west if the attack was in the morning, west to east if the attack was in the evening, to keep the sun from the bombardier's eyes. The air commanders did not like this plan, saying they were being forced to bomb down the narrow axis of the target, and that the 800-metre safety zone was not enough. For this attack, the 8th Air Force was committing all its heavy bombers, B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators, and the 9th Air Force, all its medium bombers and fighter bombers. All the aircraft would be dropping light case bombs to avoid the heavy cratering that could halt a tank advance. The aim was for some 2,500 bombers to smite an area of 6 square miles, dropping 5,000 tons of explosives, the newly invented jellied gasoline napalm and white phosphorus over 2.5 hours, blasting a path for the tanks and infantry. As a result, the US ground commanders did not anticipate much opposition. Apart from the devastating effect of the bombing, intelligence estimates from Ultra suggested that there were no more than 17,000 Germans south of the highway with perhaps 100 battle-worthy tanks, about the strength of a single US division. These came from General Paul Hausser's 7th Army, for the bulk of the German forces were still in the east, in Eberbach's Panzer Group West. Following Goodwood, von Kluge, who had now taken over direct responsibility for Army Group B, as well as continuing in command of OB West, was convinced the breakout would come at Caen and sent any available forces there. However, von Kluge had also ordered Hausser to form a reserve ready to strike against any American thrust from the Cotentin. This reserve was to contain the only armoured divisions in 7th Army, Panzer Lehr and 2 SS Panzer. In the event, Hausser only moved 2 SS tank companies into reserve, suspecting that the end of Goodwood by the British in the east indicated a fresh assault by the Americans in the west. Hausser had plenty of units in 7th Army, but not enough troops. All his divisions had been written down in the fighting since D-Day. He urgently needed fresh divisions or reinforcements, for although many famous fighting divisions were there, facing Collins's Corps, the 243rd Division, the 91st Division, the 6th Parachute Regiment, 17 SS Panzer Grenadier Regiment, Panzer Lehr. They were pale shadows of their former selves. Panzer Lehr, for example, now mustered 2,200 troops and 45 tanks, instead of its designed 15,000 troops and 200 tanks. There were only 650 soldiers left of the well-trained 352nd Division that had fought so well at Omaha. Only 2 SS Panzer was anywhere near up to strength. Even so, the ultra-estimate of German strength was not accurate. Hausser had some 30,000 troops opposite 7th Corps. They had dug in deep in the bocage and turned every deserted French village and farm into a strongpoint. These were German soldiers, and they would make a fight of it, whatever came against them. D-Day for Cobra was set for July 24th, H-hour 1 p.m., but when Air Chief Marshal Trafford Leigh-Mallory, commander of the Allied Expeditionary Air Force, arrived that morning to watch the bombing, he decided that the poor weather and low cloud would make accurate bombing impossible, and ordered the attack delayed for 24 hours. This decision was correct, but came too late to stop an accident. Although most of the bombers were contacted and turned back, and others, unable to see the ground, decided not to bomb, 300 bombers in the last formation did bomb, their cargo falling on the 30th Infantry Division, killing 25 soldiers and wounding 125 more. This bombing also alerted the Germans to the forthcoming attack, so, fearing that the enemy would advance to the Saint-Lô-Perrier road and thereby overrun the American start line, General Collins ordered the 7th Corps attack to proceed. This attack was underway when he was informed that the 24-hour postponement also applied to the ground attack, and he was to halt his troops. The forward elements of 7th Corps were already engaged and sustained casualties before the front was stabilized, and the waiting began again. During that 24-hour wait, the Army and the USAAF commanders quarrelled over the undoubted fact that, in spite of the agreed plan, the aircraft had come in to bomb over the heads of their troops and not parallel to them, along the axis of the road, as previously agreed. This argument was unresolved when H-hour 11 a.m. came round again on July 25th. Once again the bombers came in over the heads of the waiting divisions, and once again the bombs fell short. Nearly 2,000 US bombers, 1,500 heavy bombers from the 8th Air Force, and 350 medium bombers from the 9th, plus 550 fighter bombers, deluged the area with bombs, and a significant number fell on the US positions. The short bombing on July 25th caused many more casualties than the previous one. Some 600 American troops became casualties, of whom 111 were killed, including Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair, the provisional commander of the 1st U.S. Army Group. A good description of the bombing comes from Jack Capel, an infantryman of the 4th Infantry Division. I could hear a great droning, like a million bees, and like a lot of other guys got out of my foxhole to watch the attack. Hundreds of bombers were coming over, a marvellous display of air power, and the first bombs fell well to our front, in and beyond the German line. Then one fell short, in the next field, then another, and then one landed in our field, knocking me off my feet, and I got back into my foxhole fast. After that it was just indescribable. The noise was terrible, the earth shook, we just took cover and hung on, and it went on for what seemed like hours. When it was over and I crawled out, the ground looked like the surface of the moon. We lost around 600 men in that short bombing. The bombing was spread widely among the assaulting formations, but in spite of the inevitable confusion this caused, the American infantry attacked anyway, surging forward over heavily cratered ground. The rains had softened the ground, and even light case bombs caused craters. This attack was supported by heavy artillery fire and helped by the fact that by no means all the bombs dropped fell on US troops. The great majority fell on the German positions south of the Saint-Lô highway and caused a useful amount of alarm and despondency. More than 1,000 men were killed. 3 command posts of Panzer Lehr were wrecked, and at least one German battle group, Kampfgruppe Heinz, on the right flank of Panzer Lehr, effectively ceased to exist. The first objectives for the attacking force were the towns of Marigny and Saint-Gilles, 3 miles behind the German lines, and the gap between them. While the 7th Corps lunged for those positions, the 330th Infantry Regiment from the 83rd Division was diverted west, along the highway to Perrier, to block any attempt at a German flanking attack into the advancing US divisions. The 330th advanced for a while, but were then halted by shell fire and determined opposition from the 5th Parachute Regiment. More German opposition was halting the advance of the 9th Division on the right of 7th Corps, in front of Marigny. In the centre, the 4th Division had a mixed day, but with the assistance of 18 tanks, the leading battalions took the little town of La Chapelle-en-Jugé. On the left, the 30th Division, though strafed as they advanced by US fighters and fighter-bombers battered their way towards Saint-Gilles, their advance contested all the way by German troops and tanks who stopped the Americans at Heber-Crevon. By nightfall on July 25th, the total gains were limited. 7th Corps had got across the Saint-Lô highway and on average about a mile south of it, but none of the declared objectives for that day had been taken. The US history attributes some of this to the disappointment among the attacking troops at the failure of the bombing to quell the German defences. They thought that all the Germans would be killed or wounded. They had looked forward to the prospect of strolling through the bomb target area. The fact that some enemy groups survived and were able to fight seemed to prove that the air bombardment had failed to achieve its purpose. In fact, the Americans had done better than they knew. They were indeed encountering opposition, but this opposition was the best that 7th Army could manage. They could do no more, and this was soon noticed. Herb Coleman, another 4th Infantry Division soldier, comments, "After Cobra, once we got out of the hedgerow country, it went a lot faster. There would be skirmishes every day, mostly in the late afternoon, and then the Germans would pull out overnight. We had plenty of transport, which they did not, and we would pile into trucks and head after them until we caught up with them in the next day or so, and that went on until we reached Paris 3 weeks or so later." The German defence line across the Saint-Lô road was tough but very shallow. Those defence lines and interlinked fields of fire that had held up the Goodwood offensive were not present south of Saint-Lô. There was nothing behind the German front line at Saint-Lô, for the reserves that should have been there to hold the line or counter-attack the advancing American divisions were standing behind Caen. So here was a great opportunity. If the US forces pushed on July 26th, the German line would snap and the Allies would achieve that long-desired breakthrough, and General Lightning Joe Collins was just the general to keep pushing on. Such a move had already been planned if the chance arose, and it only required General Collins to proceed with the second part of his plan, the commitment of armour and the lorried infantry of the 1st Division. The fighting of July 25th had not provided the ideal conditions for this commitment, but Collins had earned that nickname for swift, decisive action, and he did not hesitate now. On the afternoon of July 25th, while his infantry were still closely engaged across the Saint-Lô highway, Collins decided to send in his armour. General Hauser spent the night of July 25th to 26th attempting to shore up his defences and find some help. He had been asking for the attachment of the 9th Panzer Division for the last 2 weeks, all without avail, and when reports came into his headquarters that evening, showing that his defences had already been penetrated in several places, they left him with no option but withdrawal, and that was forbidden by the Führer's orders. Nor was von Kluge being very supportive. The field marshal was keeping his back covered while the Gestapo and SS sought out the July 20th plotters, and he did not intend to go against the Führer's orders now. That apart, he feared that any withdrawal at this time could easily turn into a rout. He therefore ordered Hauser to move all his forces forward and offer one strong defence line against the next American attack. This only compounded the problem. Hauser's defences were already inadequate, and by forming another single line, von Kluge was putting all his eggs in one basket. If the Americans broke that line, nothing could stop them rolling forward into Brittany and on to the Loire. Following Collins's orders on July 25th, the front-line divisions spent the rest of that day and night clearing their front to let the armour through. Apart from the casualties caused by the bombing, losses had not been high. The 9th Division had not reached its objectives and had run into stout opposition once clear of the bombing zone, but it had lost only 200 men on July 25th, while the 4th and 30th Divisions, although caught by the bombing, had advanced with tank support and got forward of the road. No division had gone very far on July 25th. By nightfall, most of the 7th Corps had halted about a mile south of the highway, less than 2 miles from their start line, and this cautious advance is attributed to the effects of fighting for a month in the bocage, where caution was highly advisable. Now the bocage was being left behind, and it was time to move. On the following day, the US advance continued and rapidly picked up speed. German units were overrun, artillery concentrations and fighter-bomber attacks broke up weak German counterattacks, and by late afternoon, Collins could feel that the enemy front was coming apart. His massive corps was now on the move, infantry as well as armour, pressing on for 5, then 7, then 10 miles south of the Saint-Lô-Perrier highway, a great advance in the context of the Normandy campaign so far, a mighty deployment of American military muscle. "This thing has busted wide open," cried General Hobbs of the 30th Division on the morning of July 27th, a comment echoed by von Kluge that evening. "As of this moment, the front has burst." With no reason to hold them back, Hobbs committed his only reserve regiment, the 120th Infantry, which drove south for more than 6 miles along the River Vire without encountering significant enemy opposition. The same was true all along the 7th Corps front. The 9th Division was barrelling forward, opposed only by light shelling and mortaring. All infantry and tank opposition had subsided. Collins pulled the 9th Division into reserve and sent the 4th Division forward to mop up on the Corps front. As they did so, the rest of the Corps went forward, but suddenly German resistance was beginning to stiffen. The 1st Infantry and Combat Command B of the 3rd Armoured Division got up to Marigny before being halted by elements of the 353rd Division and some tanks of the 2nd SS Panzer. Fortunately, on the left flank, the 2nd Armoured Division and Buck Lanham's 22nd Infantry Regiment of the 4th Division had already taken Saint-Gilles, allowing Combat Command A of the 2nd Armoured to pass through, and with the taking of Saint-Gilles on July 26th, the Cobra breakthrough was achieved. It was now necessary to exploit the breach and turn the breakthrough into a breakout. The next step to that end was to close the gap towards Coutances and cut off the 7th Army units left in the Cotentin. These were to be crushed between the 7th Corps coming in from the northeast and Middleton's 8th Corps coming down the coast from the north. This relentless pressure would stop the Germans forming a new defensive line across the base of the peninsula and get Patton's Third Army moving out of the Cotentin, south and west into Brittany. This pressure by Middleton's strong 8th Corps, in reality another army, with 5 divisions, 4 infantry divisions, an armoured division and 9 battalions of artillery, would also tie the Germans down and prevent their disengagement before the completion of the 7th Corps envelopment. This envelopment required the taking of Coutances by 7th Corps, but the road to Coutances was blocked at Marigny. This could not be allowed. On July 27th, Major General Hübner ordered Combat Command B of the 3rd Armoured Division to clear the way, circling Marigny to the west while the 18th Infantry Regiment battered its way directly through the town. Marigny was duly cleared, and 1st Infantry Division pressed on to clear the high ground and bocage further west, while Combat Command A forged on down the road for Coutances. This was a true spearhead advance. The width of attack was scarcely wider than the road. The country on either side of the road still contained Germans, some fleeing towards Coutances, others more than willing to contest the American advance, and their presence slowed Combat Command A considerably. By nightfall they had only made about 3 miles and got less than halfway to Coutances. As a result, they lost 2 opportunities, the prestige of taking Coutances and the chance to take large numbers of prisoners. In the first 3 days of their advance on this disintegrating front, 1st Infantry took only 565 prisoners. Most of the Germans escaped to fight another day. Middleton's 8th Corps, the pressure force, had moved south on the morning of July 26th, but immediately ran into strong resistance, which halted the 8th Division north of Lessay. The attacks of 2 other divisions of this corps, the ill-fated 83rd and 90th, did no better. The 83rd attacked along the banks of the River Taute, and although they had twice the strength of the German defenders, the 83rd didn't do a thing and advanced no more than 200 yards. Their performance improved on the following day, when they put a regiment across the Taute. 8th Corps took 1,150 casualties on July 26th, many from the mines, and had very little ground to show for it and fewer than 100 prisoners, which indicates that they were facing good troops, but the 90th Division entered the shattered ruins of Perrier after the Germans had pulled out. However, by the evening of July 27th, 8th Corps had crossed the Lessay-Perrier highway and were beginning to squeeze the remaining German forces in the south of the Cotentin. On the 7th Corps front, German resistance continued to stiffen. It remained stiff when Combat Command B and the 1st Infantry Division took up the advance again next day, July 28th. Cambernon fell in the afternoon, but the American advance had slowed sufficiently to let the German forces get away, slipping out from the trap forming at the base of the Cotentin as 8th Corps advanced south of the Lessay-Perrier highway. The 1st Division and Combat Command B were also obliged to halt 2 miles from Coutances and wait there while 8th Corps entered the town. As a result, large numbers of German troops got away, the American pursuit being held up by a carpet of mines, anti-tank and anti-personnel, which the German forces had left behind. The official history sums up the final result at Coutances. Aided by the terrain, the weather, the darkness, the absence of Allied night fighters, and the extreme caution of American troops who had come to respect the ability of the Germans to fight in the hedgerows, the German troops facing the 8th Corps had neatly slipped out of the trap set by Cobra. American commanders began to suspect an impending withdrawal, and operations in the 7th Corps sector confirmed it. Despite precaution, warning and suspicion on the part of the Americans, the Germans gave them the slip. This judgment by the US official history, if accurate, seems harsh. Here, as later in the Falaise pocket, there was disappointment because the plan had not succeeded 100% by trapping all the German forces, a complaint which overlooked and therefore diminished what had been accomplished, the breakout from the Allied bridgehead. It is also fair to point out, whatever was claimed later, that it was Montgomery's strategic plan that had worked and stretched the German line to breaking point, without employing that attacking all the time and everywhere policy advocated by Eisenhower. Carping about the escape of some shattered German units from Coutances should not be allowed to obscure that fact or this great American success. Besides, many elements of the German forces had been trapped, and on July 29th, German columns on roads near Roncy were attacked by Allied fighter-bombers. Over 500 German vehicles were destroyed in this fighter-bomber feast, good practice for the slaughter they would inflict on the Germans later, east of Falaise. Operation Cobra lasted officially for only 3 days. By the evening of July 27th, Bradley could see that he had achieved a breakthrough. Now he had to exploit it by getting all his forces engaged, notably those of the 19th Corps and the 5th Corps east of the Vire, who had to start that pivoting movement towards the east from Caumont. Their main task during Cobra was to stay active enough to prevent any movement of enemy forces into the flank of Cobra. Now they could make more positive moves, but which? General Gero of the much-reduced 5th Corps only had 2 divisions, the veteran 2nd Infantry and the newly arrived 5th Infantry. This force, with an abundance of artillery and strong tank support, still outnumbered the Germans to their front, but Gero's front was too wide. Therefore, several days before Cobra, the British front had been shifted west, giving the Second Army responsibility for Caumont. British artillery therefore supported Gero's attack south and west to the banks of the Via on July 26th. This attack went slowly and was still continuing on July 27th when Bradley informed General Gero that 19th Corps was being shifted west of the Via and that 5th Corps, strengthened by the 35th Division, would be responsible for the ground between that river and the British. This widened Gero's front yet again and thinned out his forces. Bradley had already digested the gains of Cobra. Now he wanted to continue his attack on a wider front, without giving the enemy any time to regroup. For Corlet's 19th Corps, this meant an immediate advance south to take the town of Via and the Forêt de Saint-Sever, 7 miles to the west of it. Via was a major road junction, and possessing Via would give the Americans another hinge for when they turned their forces east. Meanwhile, Patton's Third Army was to become operational on August 1st and turn into Brittany. Not only the 19th Corps were heading for Via. So was Gero's 5th Corps. Bradley seems to have neglected 5th Corps at this time, for Gero had been given no specific objectives, merely told to keep Bradley informed of his intentions and progress. Gero therefore decided on classic pursuit tactics, to follow the enemy on his front closely, wherever he went to prevent him digging in or establishing any kind of defence line. The German forces opposing 5th Corps were trying to do just that, attempting to fall back to some defensible position, dig in there and hold it against any oncoming forces. Under Gero's pressure they fell back, but slowly. The terrain astride the Via was bocage country. The Americans fighting there would not get out of the hedgerow area for a while yet, or gain ground without further losses. On July 30th alone, the Germans inflicted almost 1,000 casualties on 5th Corps in the fighting around Torigny-sur-Vire. Meanwhile, the British on 5th Corps' left were coming up fast in their latest attack, Operation Bluecoat, and the US 19th Corps on Gero's right were advancing south and widening their front. If these advances continued, the British and the US 19th Corps would pinch 5th Corps out of the line before Via. Gero therefore decided that, pending further orders from Bradley, he would halt his forces on the general west-east line formed by the rivers Vire and Souleuvre, 7 miles north of Via. West of the river, Corlet's 19th Corps were coming down on Via from the northwest, with currently little in front to oppose it. There was a yawning gap in the middle of 7th Army to the 19th Corps' front, but this happy situation did not last. Von Kluge was at last bringing forces west, most notably 2nd Panzer from Panzer Group West, which was tasked to cross the Via, close the gap and launch a counterattack on the American forces west of Caumont in conjunction with the 2nd Parachute Corps. This order was later changed to place 2nd Panzer under command of the 84th Infantry Corps to shore up the positions of the 352nd Division on the west bank of the Via. More than that, von Kluge could not do. The Canadian the 3rd Corps were attacking south of Caen, and Caen was still the critical front. Corlet's 19th Corps were moving on Tessy-sur-Vire, but 2nd Panzer got there first, and when the troops of General Hobbs's 30th Division moved on Tessy from the Moyon-Trois-Gros line on July 28th, they ran into strong opposition. Fighting continued all that day and on July 29th, but no progress was made. On the other hand, the committal of 2nd Panzer to stop 19th Corps at Trois-Gros, although it had plugged the gap in the 7th Army line, prevented 2nd Panzer carrying out its second and far more important task, a counterattack into the flanks of 7th Corps. Fighting continued in this area for the next 2 days, with the German forces increased by the arrival of yet another armoured division, 116 Panzer, which crossed the Via on July 30th and began to butt against the lower shoulder of the 19th Corps advance at Beaucaudray, west of Tessy, where Combat Command A of the 2nd Armoured Division were swinging east to confront them. Hanging on to Beaucaudray became more immediately important than taking Tessy. American pressure was increasing in the west and would go on increasing. There was nothing the Germans could do to prevent the build-up of forces on their front, and as the pressure continued, the German front west of the Vire began to crumble. On August 1st, General Hobbs of the 30th Division was finally able to send a force of infantry into Tessy. This attack was not completed. The town still contained defenders, and shells continued to fall on the town from German positions further south for some days, but in the broader sense this hardly mattered. By containing the German attempted counterattack on Collins's corps west of the Vire, 19th Corps had given the rest of First Army time to widen their breach south of Coutances. First Army had broken out of the bridgehead and opened up a gap in the German defences, which von Kluge had no means of filling. The way to the south was now wide open, and by August 1st American troops were pouring out of the Cotentin, heading at speed for the Loire and Brittany. Spring and Bluecoat, July 25th to August 6th. The dogged courage and determination of the British foot soldier was never more fully displayed than during Bluecoat. Belfield and Essamay, the Battle of Normandy. With the American breakout from the bridgehead at the end of July, the third phase of the Normandy battle had been completed. At this point, before moving on to what followed, it would be as well to summarise the various events of recent weeks, through the build-up to the breakout, sum up the situation in Normandy at the end of July, and ventilate some of the still prevailing myths. Operation Cobra, or the St. Lo breakout, as the American veterans call it, came as a great relief to the Allied commanders and their political leaders in London and Washington. They would now cease carping, at least for a while, and the relief was general, although some of the senior commanders at Schaeff may have regretted that the St. Lo breakout stymied their ongoing campaign to get rid of General Montgomery. The recent discontent had focused on Montgomery and the British Second Army, and this feeling would lead to greater discontent in the future when the territorial progress of the American armies, the First and Third, was matched with that achieved by the British Second Army and the Canadian First Army. The popular myth that the American forces did all the fighting in Normandy while the British and Canadians sat in is largely based on the events after Cobra, but has its origins in the fighting of the previous weeks. The progress of the Allied armies certainly varied, but for several very good reasons. Second Army's numerous critics rarely compare like with like, not least in terms of enemy opposition. As is clear from the previous chapters, the opposition faced by the Americans at Cherbourg and Saint-Lô was far less in both quantity and quality than that confronting Second Army at Caen. The numerous American delays in June and July, on which many American historians are surprisingly reticent, were largely due to the weather, which affected both armies, and the terrain, the bocage, which was wider and deeper in the west than in the east, but by no means exclusive to the First Army front. All the Allied armies had problems with supply at this stage, especially of artillery ammunition and later on with petrol. The British delays were also due to the defences of Caen and the strength and tenacity of the enemy forces in manning those defences. The American forces certainly made great gains in the south and west at the end of July and in early August, after the St. Lo breakout, and deserve full credit for this, but the breakout came in the First Army sector on July 26th, because Monty had always planned that it should, largely because the Americans had both the men and the space to employ them. Nor was there much opposition. As the US history readily admits, no German defensive capability was apparent in the Pontault-Boldt-Bressay-Villedieu-les-Poils sector, the post-breakout area crossed by the US armies on Cobra. The same cannot be said of the area chosen for Bluecoat and Spring, the operations in which the British and Canadians were now to be engaged. Selecting and maintaining the aim for a battle or campaign is the prime task of any commander, and hindsight suggests that a more nationalistic or chauvinistic leader, eyeing posterity and the subsequent claims made by historians, might have let the Americans take on the panzers, while the British advanced to take the ground and hog the subsequent credit. That was not Montgomery's plan. That plan was dictated entirely by strategic considerations, particularly over the question of ground and the known abundance of American manpower. Whatever complaints are made against Monty, the plan that worked in Normandy was prepared and executed by Monty the commanding general, and he deserves full credit for it. The success of this strategic plan in diverting German armour to the Second Army sector is shown by the distribution of German panzer and infantry forces at midnight on July 24th, just before the St. Lo breakout. In the American sector, between the Cotentin and Caumont, were 2 panzer divisions, 2 SS Panzer and Panzer Lehr, mustering a total of 150 tanks, plus 17 SS Panzer Grenadier Division lorried infantry and 5 assorted infantry divisions. All these units, with the exception of 2 SS Panzer, had been well written down in the last 6 weeks and were short of transport, both motorised and horse-drawn. Facing the British Second Army between Caumont and Caen were the 7 German panzer units of Panzer Group West, 12th SS Panzer, 10th SS Panzer, 9th SS Panzer, 1st SS Panzer, 21st Panzer, 2nd Panzer, 116 Panzer, and the 7th and 8th Werfer Brigades of 2nd Panzer Corps, and 6 infantry divisions, together mustering no less than 645 tanks and 92 infantry battalions. Many of these units had also been written down in the previous fighting. 7 panzer divisions on full establishment should have had over 1,200 tanks, but the discrepancy in numbers is still clear. Not only were there more German panzer divisions ranged against the British Second Army, but these were larger and better equipped divisions. An SS Panzer division mustered around 20,000 men with 6 battalions of infantry, while a Wehrmacht Panzer division mustered around 12,500 men with 4 battalions of infantry. Panzer divisions were also fully motorised, while Wehrmacht infantry divisions, which had been reduced to a ration strength of around 8,000 men, relied on horse-drawn transport. A panzer division, especially an SS Panzer division, was more formidable than a standard Wehrmacht division in every way, as anyone who fought the SS will attest. Here again, these figures are ration strength figures, and do not reflect the writing down of German divisions in the battle so far. But again, the discrepancy between the US and British front is clear. Then there is the question of quality. At the end of July, according to Scheff, the Allies had captured 78,000 Germans, of which 14,000 had been taken by the British and Canadians. Eisenhower's naval aide, Captain Harry C. Butcher, reports this information in his memoirs, clearly believing that it represents another American first. Captain Butcher was a naval officer with no knowledge of land fighting, and his job at Scheff was chiefly concerned with media relations. Butcher was a PR man. He therefore may not have realised that these figures indicated the varying quality of the German troops on the Normandy front. 64,000 of these gave up and surrendered to the Americans more than 30,000 at Cherbourg, while only 14,000 gave up and surrendered to the British. The German forces on the British front tended to go on fighting. Good troops do not surrender in any quantity. These facts and figures should be considered when estimates are made of ground gained on the respective Allied fronts, and chauvinism does not enter into it. General Bradley, for one, was well aware of the help the British containment of the SS Panzer divisions on the Caumont-Caen sector gave to his own advance from St. Lo, but this broad picture was to change immediately after the breakout. Suddenly, if belatedly, grasping Montgomery's strategy, the Germans hastily switched 2 of their tank units, 2nd Panzer and 116 Panzer West, in an attempt to stem the American advance. By that time it was too late, and further transfers of armour were stopped by the need to contain the British thrust south from Caumont Operation Bluecoat. But the retention of the German army on the Second Army front was of inestimable benefit to the American forces in the West, as Bradley freely admitted. Monty's primary task, he wrote, was to attract the German troops to the British front, that we might more easily secure Cherbourg and get into position for the breakout. In this diversionary mission, Monty was more than successful. One might quibble slightly with the phrase diversionary mission, or suggest that Dempsey is more accurate than Monty, but the general point seems clear. The British took on the panzers until the Americans could make their breakout, and since the panzer divisions were never less than formidable, the sooner this breakout came, the better. After Goodwood, some swift action was necessary, if only to silence the rising tide of complaints at Chafe. The British official history, in a rare moment of acerbity, comments, "None of the discomfort at home and in America would have arisen if the American attack in the West could have started on the day after Goodwood ended, as originally intended. At the time, it seemed to the public that the capture of St. Lo and the Goodwood attack had done nothing to quicken the slow pace of Allied progress. Apart from the weather, the bocage and the enemy, one reason for the slow progress across the Allied front since D-Day had been the chronic problem of supply. This was because, even at the end of July, they still did not have a large working port. Cherbourg was open, but working at nothing like normal capacity, and the Allies were still forced to land stores via the remaining mulberry at Arromanches, through the limited facilities of Port-en-Bessin or Courseulles, or by transshipping men and stores from ship to shore in UKWs or landing craft, manhandling them ashore over open beaches. Inevitably, without the facilities of a working port, there were delays. One major factor inhibiting the progress of the armies, and one that would grow as the campaign became more mobile, was a chronic shortage of fuel, but even so, the tonnages sent ashore were vast. By the morning of D+50, July 25th, no less than 631,000 men, 153,000 vehicles, and 689,000 tons of stores, plus 68,000 tons of coal, petrol, oil and lubricants, had been landed in the Second Army sector alone. The number of vehicles included tanks, but the sheer quantity of vehicles in the cramped bridgehead created problems, not least in the rapid deterioration of the few metalled roads and the constant clouds of dust which attracted enemy shellfire. If troops and stores were on the way in, the wounded were on the way out and casualties were mounting. Up to June 30th, Allied casualties had totalled 24,698 British and Canadian and 37,034 Americans. American dead came to 5,113, and British and Canadian dead to 3,356, the larger American figure being accounted for at this stage by the losses on Omaha on June 13th, June 6th. To make up these losses, 38,000 British and Canadian troops and 41,000 US troops were landed in the bridgehead in the first 3 weeks after D-Day. The casualty figures at the end of the battle will be given later, but every army on the Normandy front was having trouble with manpower. At the end of June, the German 7th Army alone had lost a total of 80,783 men, including 9 generals more than the combined casualty total of the Allied armies. The British, Canadian and US troop figures would soon diverge, for the British were almost out of manpower. Although the US 1st and British 2nd each had 15 divisions in France, there were only 6 British or Canadian divisions left in Britain to reinforce 21st Army Group. The Americans had 9 divisions in Britain waiting to cross the Channel, and many more divisions in the USA, or already crossing the Atlantic. These new American divisions would be landed directly in France, and in time the US forces in Europe would muster 61 divisions. Even at full strength, the British and Canadian armies in Europe could not produce more than 22 divisions, and that figure could not be maintained for long as casualties mounted. These factors should be borne in mind before we return to the Caen to Caumont front, where the British and Canadian armies were attacking again. While the US 1st and 3rd armies were forging south out of the Cotentin and past Saint-Lô towards Brittany and the Loire, the British were engaged in yet another slogging dogfight in the difficult country south of Caumont. Caumont had represented the meeting point between the British and American forces in the first days of Overlord, when the town itself had been in the American sector, but, as related, the dividing line between the American and British armies had shifted west in the last days of July to cover the advance of 8th Corps on Avranches. The American 19th Corps moved west of the Vire, 5th Corps followed, and by the beginning of August, Caumont was in the 2nd Army sector. After Cobra, this situation presented Montgomery with an opportunity for 2nd Army. Following Goodwood and Cobra, two strong attacks on the flanks, it appeared likely that the German front in the centre, south of Caumont, would be starved of troops and tanks and ripe for an attack. There was, however, a problem with terrain. First of all, the area south of Caumont was Bocage. The largest town in the area is Villa-Bocage, and the front is hemmed in on the east by the steep-sided Orne Valley, steep enough to have sheer rocky escarpments, and on the west by the bulk of a dominant hill feature, Mont Pinson. The forces defending this terrain therefore enjoyed a clear advantage in the ground. It was therefore recognised that any advance south of Caumont would be a hard slog, and so it proved. From the west, the Allied line-up at the start of August was as follows: US Third Army, US First Army, British Second Army, and Canadian First Army. The US 12th Army Group became operational under Bradley on August 1st, with General Courtney Hodges taking command of the US First Army and Patton arriving in Normandy to take command of the US Third Army. For the moment, however, General Montgomery remained in operational command of the Allied forces in Normandy, remaining in post as ground force commander until General Eisenhower took command of the armies some time in the not-too-distant future. The launching of the Canadian Second and US Third Armies into the Normandy battle will be covered in the next chapter, but the prime task of the British and Canadian armies now was to fix the German panzer divisions in position and prevent them switching west to impede the American breakout. It was also necessary to advance south in order to deny the Germans a hinge, some secure point on which their armies could swing as they fell back or were pushed back from the Cotentin and Vire. One way to prevent the Germans finding such a hinge was to maintain pressure towards the south and take the most likely hinge, the German positions around the 365-metre, 1,200 feet, high Mont Pinson, which stood due east of Vire. This attack, Operation Bluecoat, by 3 corps of Second Army, would go in as soon as British armoured units could be shifted to the west end of the British line. Meanwhile, to keep up the pressure in the east, the 2nd Canadian Corps, reinforced by the 7th Armoured Division and the Guards Armoured Division, struck south down the Caen to Falaise Road on Operation Spring. This attack had been planned on July 21st during the final stages of the Goodwood battle, and the Canadian advance began early on the morning of July 25th, the day the US Army to the west started Cobra. General Guy Simons, who was in charge of Operation Spring, was fully aware that this was a holding operation to engage the enemy divisions on his front, and no major territorial gains were anticipated. The spearhead of this Canadian attack was the veteran 3rd Canadian Infantry Division, advancing on Tilly-la-Campagne, where it was swiftly engaged by units of 1 SS Panzer. The fight around Tilly went on all day, while on the west of the Caen-Falaise Road, the 2nd Canadian Infantry Division advanced through Verrières towards Rocancourt, where they were held by fire from the Verrières Ridge. Neil Hamilton was a forward observer signaller of the 4th Royal Canadian Artillery, working with the infantry of the 2nd Canadian Division. You will have to remember that I was a very scared kid and did not keep any books or notes, so it is just flashes from that time. I remember one day, as we were waiting in our Bren gun carriers to move forward, we saw an infantry soldier with a heavy load of ammunition crawling up the ditch. He came to a dead horse and did not want to stand up, and so he crawled over it, and when he was on top it just caved in under him. I'm pretty sure his buddies did not hug him for a while after that. Our first job was burying dead Germans, and that was terrible, but what they tell you is true, you soon get used to it. Our troop had a total of 4 guns, the battery 8, our regiment 72. My job was observing and passing corrections to the guns a mile or so in the rear. At first I was driver-operator in an armoured car. We had a captain with us who was never sober, but he was soon replaced by a great officer, Captain Harvey. We crossed the Orne for the attack on Verrières. The river was wide and a mess, dead cows, horses, bodies, all floating, everything black from the hot summer sun. Out on the plain there were many burned-out tanks from previous battles, and the shelling and firing was still going on. We had to dig in, as when those 88s come by, you are glad of some shelter, believe me. My crew took casualties, and we changed around many times, but all I got was some shrapnel in my legs and shock. We accompanied the infantry as they advanced, travelling with the CO to get him artillery support when he needed it, like at Verrières. We were so under strength that you could go 30 hours on the radio without a break. The guns were switched to support different battalions, so you never got to stop. As we went on, we met SS, and once we went to help a wounded Jerry when he produced a pistol from his tunic and had to be disposed of. There was a lot of sniping, and that did not stop all the way to Falaise. This Canadian battle spread rapidly to the banks of the Orne, and although May-sur-Orne at the northern end of the Suisse Normande was taken, lost and retaken several times that day, no real progress was made by the Canadian infantry, although the attack was pressed with great resolution. 1,500 men of the 2nd Canadian Division had been lost by the time the battle ended at dusk. This hold-up for the infantry held up the 2 tank divisions, who were given no breach to exploit. The 7th armoured the Desert Rats, and the Guards Armoured came forward to engage the tanks and anti-tank guns of the 1st SS Panzer and the 9th SS Panzer. A number of German tanks were knocked out, some by British tanks, others by aircraft of 2nd TAF, but the 2 British armoured divisions lost 56 tanks that day and made no ground. Nevertheless, the main aim had been achieved. The Crack 1 and 9 SS were retained on the Caen front in the first hours and days of Cobra. The Canadian official history records that the 2nd Canadian Corps struck a stone wall at Verrières, and that, with the exception of the Dieppe raid in August 1942, July 25, 1944, was the Canadian Army's costliest day of operations in the Second World War. On July 27th, Montgomery met Bradley and Dempsey to review the situation and issued new instructions for future developments. The main blow of the campaign had now been delivered by the US First Army, and it was clearly imperative for the other elements of 21st Army Group to do whatever they could to help the Americans forward. Even now, 6 German panzer divisions were still based on the British-Canadian front east of Noyers, 116 Panzer, having gone west to shore up the German line against the Americans south of Tessy-sur-Vire. So Monty decreed that the Second Army must strike a heavy blow west of Noyers, between that town and Caumont, where there were currently no panzer divisions at all. Attention now shifts to the thrust of the British Second Army south from Caumont towards Montpinçon Operation Bluecoat, and the move of the US Fifth Corps on their right flank towards Vire. Switching strong armoured forces from one side to the other of the Second Army front took a little time, and in that time the US Fifth Corps advanced on Vire. This Fifth Corps attack would be limited by the need to keep in touch with the British on their left, but once the Germans had started to move back, it was essential to keep them going. In his directive to the Fifth Corps divisions, General Gero underlined this point. We must keep going to remain contact and not give the Boche time to dig in. See that all understand this. The opposing German forces came from the 2nd Parachute Corps. This unit was pulling back to maintain contact with German forces west of the Vire, which were coming under pressure from the US 19th Corps. On July 28th, the 5th Corps duly followed up the 2nd Parachute Corps withdrawal, taking the Saint-Jean-de-Bezons ridge, encountering little resistance, and taking very few prisoners from the doughty Parachute Corps. The next objective for the 5th Corps was the Soulèvre-Vire River line, 11 miles to the south and west. A considerable bound forward in itself, and especially so for the country, was a jumble of low hills and woods with plenty of bocage in the intervening valleys. This bound presented Gero with a dilemma. If he did not press on, the enemy could dig in. If he did press on while the British were still forming for Bluecoat, he might expose his left flank to enemy attack, and getting tangled up in the bocage was just an added complication. Fortunately, the Germans withdrew beyond the river line, and on July 29th-5th, Corps were able to form a front between the village of Condé-sur-Vire and the British line near Caumont. In spite of the steady German withdrawal, the 5th Corps advance had not been uncontested. The 2nd Parachute Corps left plenty of small parties behind, sowed an abundance of mines, and kept the advancing Americans on their toes with a number of those small counterattacks from company-sized formations backed with tanks and mortars. On July 29th, with Second Army attacking on the following day, and in the knowledge that the Germans were now in full retreat south of the Cotentin to the west, Géraud ordered all his troops to push on, brushing aside any resistance to get into the town of Vire. This order came just a day late. By the evening of July 29th, the enemy had formed a fresh defence line at Torigny-sur-Vire, a village 4 miles east of the Vire River. Attempting to take that village and the surrounding hills cost the 5th Corps over 1,000 casualties and halted their advance for the moment. Only for the moment, though. On July 31st, von Kluge ordered the 2nd Parachute Corps to fall back, rather than be outflanked by the bulging front formed by the 19th Corps to the west. This enabled 5th Corps to press on quickly across otherwise ideal defensive country to the Vire-sur-l'Euvre river line, meeting more resistance as they neared the river. 3 Allied corps, the British 8th Corps on the left, the US 5th Corps in the centre, and the US 19th Corps on the right, were now converging on Vire, the first 2 from the north, the latter from the northwest. 5th Corps in the middle looked like being pinched out unless it could get ahead of the rest and grab the roads. Géraud ordered the 5th Division to halt on the river line, but some battalions were to go across and establish a bridgehead, just in case they could go forward again, as Géraud fully intended to do. In short, he told one of the tank regiment commanders, hurry. This order again came a little late. British armour from the 8th Corps had already got ahead, crossed into the 5th Corps zone and taken 2 bridges across the Vire. The 5th Corps infantry followed up the British tanks, but the narrow Norman roads were not big enough for 2 corps to use at the same time. Some confusion reigned as the British advance moved down from Caumont, with the 11th Armoured Division moving on to high ground east of the River Vire, just within the Second Army boundary. Meanwhile, west of the Vire, the US 19th Corps were also moving south and exploiting east. There was very little to stop it to begin with, and a useful gap 19th Corps might hope to exploit was still open between the 84th Infantry Corps and 2nd Parachute Corps, a gap that von Kluge was most anxious to fill, moving 2nd Panzer Division from south of Caumont for that purpose. Another unit moving west was the 58th Panzer Corps, a major unit transferred from 15th Army to Panzer Group West, a corps which von Kluge intended to use in a counter-attack towards Marigny and Saint-Gilles on the 7th Corps front. These plans faltered because the situation on the western end of the line was changing so rapidly that plans were rendered out of date before they could be issued. The fundamental fact, however, was quite clear. If von Kluge was to stabilise his front in the west and conduct an orderly withdrawal to some sound defence line in the east, he must have more troops west of the River Vire. He therefore had no option but to take troops from the front south of Caen. The 116th Panzer Division, formerly with 15th Army, went across to 7th Army, where, with 2nd Panzer, it was to attack north and west and close the gap at the Vire River by Notre-Dame-de-Senilly. This move began on July 27th and was followed on July 28th, when the 67th Panzer Corps took command of the 2nd Panzer and what was left of the 352nd Division and Panzer Lehr. Coming up in support was 2 SS Panzer, which deployed east of the village of Percy on July 29th and was poised to thrust northwest against 19th Corps, now making for Vire against opposition, estimated by General Corlett as no more than 3,000 battered and ill-equipped enemy soldiers. This proved an underestimate. While all these German units were short of kit and battle-weary, Combat Command A of the 30th Division ran into 2nd Panzer just west of the Vire on July 27th and met stout opposition. On the morning of July 28th, 2nd Panzer was able to put a motorised regiment of Panzer Grenadiers and about 20 tanks to oppose them, while the rest of 2nd Panzer was assembling around Tessy-sur-Vire. With the aid of attached elements from the other German units, the 19th Corps advance was brought to a halt on a narrow front between Trois-Gots and Moyon. Fighting in this area went on for the next 3 days, with 116 Panzer adding weight to the defenders' line. Trois-Gots did not fall until the evening of July 31st. On the following day, Combat Command A of the 30th Division led the 29th Division towards Tessy-sur-Vire, which finally fell on August 2nd. This advance further reduced the German strength in this sector while stopping the 7th Army constructing a new defensive line across the base of the Cotentin. Further attempts to stem the collapse of the German position in this central sector between Caumont and Vire were ended by the advance of the British 8th Corps from Caumont. Caumont is the closest Normandy can offer to a hill town. Perched on a high spur, it offers commanding views over the surrounding countryside, most of which, even today, 60 years after the battle, is the worst form of bocage. South of Caumont, the small field and high hedgerow pattern, typical of the Norman bocage, is reinforced by woods, steep-sided valleys and hills. There are even fewer roads than usual, and only one led south. Otherwise, the narrow lanes south of Caumont link up small villages which the Germans had long since turned into fortresses. These villages were occupied by the 276th and 326th Infantry Divisions, with 21 Panzer in close support. Add a great quantity of mines, many laid by the Americans when they were in this sector. Throw in a good number of Nebelwerfer mortars and machine guns. Add a few Tiger tanks and Jagdpanthers, and the country below Caumont can be imagined as a very formidable obstacle indeed. The ground between Caumont and Montpinçon undulates like a green sea in a heavy swell, each undulation a perfect defensive position. The claim in the US official history that only the bombed and inexperienced 326th Infantry Division stood in the way of the Bluecoat attack would seem to be incorrect. The Germans had defied eviction from this sector by the US 5th Corps for the last 7 weeks and stiffened their defences considerably in the process. General Dempsey had allocated 6 divisions of 30th Corps and 8th Corps for this Bluecoat operation. The 43rd, Wessex, 50th, Northumbrian, and 15th Scottish Infantry Divisions, plus 11th Armoured, 7th Armoured and Guards Armoured. These last 2 armoured divisions would be in reserve, ready to exploit forward when the chance arose. Because of the terrain, the first part of Operation Bluecoat was primarily an infantry operation.